Welcome back to the show. This is episode number 552 of Surf Splendor. And today's guest has been making meaningful contributions to surfing for 4 decades now. And depending on when you discovered surfing, probably dictates your perception of whether you know him as a professional surfer, a writer, a magazine editor, or a film and documentary producer, filmmaker. He actually began publishing articles in Surfing magazine in 1982, and by the late 90s, he was editor in chief of Surfer magazine through 2005. He wrote and directed a documentary called Hollywood Don't Surf, which featured Steven Spielberg, Quentin Tarantino. That film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival. He's made a number of excellent documentaries with friend and filmmaking partner Stacy Peralta. Those films included Riding Giants, which I saw in IMAX in 2004, went to the theater for that one. They made a documentary called Crips and Bloods, Made in America, which I watched. I forget where I even saw that on TV at the time, but I was shocked to see his name and Stacy's associated with it because it wasn't surf related, but it was really, really good. Well done. And then most recently, they did the Yin and Yang of Jerry Lopez, which hopefully you saw. Our guest also won an Emmy for Best Documentary Series for directing the ESPN 30 for 30 episode of Hawaiian, The Legend of Eddie Aikau. He's also published 7 books, the latest of which is a memoir that gets released next week on April 22nd. That is entitled Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. It's available through D'Angelo Publications. I've linked to it on surfsplendorpodcast.com, where you can pre-order it if you're watching this before the 22nd of April. Truth is, he and I have a lot to discuss here, more than can possibly fit into one episode. He's got an incredible history, very well great job talking about it as well spoken, and a great communicator. So we'll have him back on the show in the future. But before we get into today's episode, I owe a debt of gratitude to our industry partners without whom this show would not be possible. That is, of course, the Surfrider Foundation, VAER Watches, and Real Water Sports. The Surfrider Foundation, I am proud to announce, we just published a podcast together. They've employed me to produce and host a podcast series, and the first episode is called The Most Polluted Beach in America. That episode is available now. You can search for it on whatever podcast app you use. Just look for the Surfrider Foundation podcast, or it's on their YouTube channel. If you're watching this right now, click over when you're done here and search for the Surfriders channel, and you could find that episode there. It tells a story that you need to hear, actually, because the dirtiest beach in America, the most polluted beach in America, is a totally solvable problem. They have plans in place for how to solve it. They just need the political will to change it. And so that's why voices need to be heard. Your eyeballs need to see this problem, and then you can activate and get involved to help solve it. And of course, become a member at surfrider.org. Real Water Sports is our retail partner with a 1,500 surfboard inventory, along with anything and everything that you would need for any other water sport. So go to realwatersports.com. And then VAER Watches, I'll save you 15% if you want to buy a beautiful VAER, VAER, VAERwatches.com/surf splendor to enjoy that discount. Okay, without any further ado, my name is David Scales for Surf Splendor, and here is my first ever conversation with Sam George. I hope that you enjoy.
Surf Splendor.
Sure. You've ridden waves at 695 distinct surf spots in 42 countries. My question to you is, when did you start keeping a tally?
Well, I never did keep a tally. To tell you the truth, this was like maybe last year, maybe a year and a half ago. My brother Matt, who is, of course, also very well traveled, we were just talking about things, and he goes, do you think you could possibly add up all the surf spots you've ever surfed? And I went, wow, that would be a really interesting exercise. So basically, it took me quite a while. It's not like I did it all at once, but what I would do is I would get out a world map and I would just start tracing my finger down the coast of all the various coastlines I've been to, and started counting up the spots. And the fun thing was, and I've talked to some of my friends about this, and some learned surfers, like the esteemed Matt Warshaw and stuff, where they said, well, okay, what counts as a surf spot? And I said, okay, I'm making a distinction. For example, in Santa Cruz, Sewer Peak, all the way to the Hook, is all Pleasure Point. But Sewer Peak is a completely different surf spot than First Peak Pleasure Point, which is a completely different spot than 38th Avenue, which is a completely different spot than the Hook. So I'm counting those as separate surf spots. So, but for example, J Bay, you know, albatross on the very inside and magnatubes on the very outside, those are two distinct spots. But the super tubes, tubes, and magnatubes or whatever, all in that one where you would ride one wave at that spot, I count that as one spot. So it took a while to kind of figure it all out. And at the end, yeah, I came up with, at the time it was 693, but I've added a couple more since I wrote that number down. So yeah, it's a lot of surf spots, you know.
I I agree with the way that you actually did the exercise, but I'm thinking if you're going solely on memory, you certainly have forgotten some. So it's got to be more than 695.
You know what? I have to admit, I've been told that I have a very acute memory. Um,
Okay.
and by like I said, by tracing my finger down the coast and also looking at like surf guides and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think I have a pretty accurate list there. Not that I was obsessed over the list. It was just a fun exercise to do. I
I
actually
like it.
thought it would be over 1,000.
Really.
Yeah. When I got to
Um,
693, I went, oh, okay, that's still a lot of surf spots. I mean, I would say without, sounding self-aggrandizing, very few people have surfed as many surf spots as me in the world. Maybe Randy Rarick.
yeah, no, I agree. I
Randy
mean, look,
Rarick. Yeah.
42 countries is way more than 99% of the people on the planet have ever been to as well.
Oh yeah. Well, Randy has surfed more than that because he surfed wind swell in the Black Sea,
Yeah.
and things like that. He's gone. But there's guys that have been pushing that sort of thing, younger guys, Dylan Graves, he's new to his, sojourning, but he's surfed a lot of spots because he's surfing a lot of the out of the way spots, you
Yeah,
know. But I
totally.
have to admit, having surfed my way from in California, especially the border to Cabo San Lucas, and having surfed the Gulf Coast, the East Coast, all over Hawaii, and especially Australia, from way north of Noosa all the way back around, all the way up to Nauru. That covers a lot of geography. You know what I mean? Uh,
Tremendous. Yeah.
yeah, and I had experiences like, for example, the first year I went to Australia in 1979. Uh, my whole dream was to surf Burley Heads. That's all I wanted to do was surf Burley Heads. And at the time, I was working at a surf shop in Santa Barbara, and we were one of the first dealers, retail outlets for Rip Curl wetsuits. So I had met some of the guys from Rip Curl. So it's a longer story, but I eventually ended up at Burley. I didn't get to be in the Stubbies event, but I was there because Rip Curl, because I worked for that shop, they gave me an entry into the Bells Beach trials. But I was up in Queensland. I got to surf Burley. My dream was fulfilled. I knew some of the pro surfers, of course, because I'd been surfing in amateur competition, and I knew some of the surfers. But it was hilarious because after the contest was over, all sponsored surfers got in their sponsored surfers vans and their buddies' cars, and they all headed for Sydney. I didn't have a ride. I had to hitchhike outside of the Burley Towers. Okay. So I'm got my thumb out, my board, my backpack. A Kingswood station wagon pulls over, and it's Doug Warbrick, the founder of Rip Curl, and one of his guys that worked at the shop. And he had recognized me. Aren't you, you're from California, right? Yeah. Hello, Doug. He goes, so where you headed? I go, eventually Bells. And he goes, well, we're going to be servicing all of our Rip Curl accounts from Noosa back to Bells. We'll give you a ride if you don't mind it taking 10 days. And I said, are you kidding? I would love to do that. So I jumped into the back seat of Doug Warbrick's, Kingswood station wagon, and off I went on this Australian odyssey to every Rip Curl dealer. I went to every surf town. I met so many legendary Australians. I had dinner with Peter Troy, one of the, for his generation, one of the best traveled surfers in the world. I met legendary shapers. Uh, it was incredible. And they kind of ditched me in Sydney for about a week. I had to fend for myself for a while. But then I got back in the Kingswood and headed out down to Bells Beach. So I got to really experience a lot of Australia. And this is just an example that a lot of my Australian friends, they never did that. They never got
Right.
to do that. You
Yeah.
know,
Just from
years
having that
later, when I'd
open
go down to
mind.
compete in Bells with my friends, I would have to drive because they'd never been there. But when we get to the outskirts of town, they made me get in the back seat because they said, "No way, mate. No bloody Seppo is going to drive us into Torquay." I had to get in the back seat.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, those kind of experiences, I really got to explore a lot of coastlines in foreign countries.
Um, Before we dive deeper into the journeying, what do you attribute the recall to and the memory?
You know, I, no one's ever asked me that question before. You know what I think it is? I grew up an inveterate reader. My dad was he was a naval officer, but a very big reader, and he used to read to us. And when I was a kid, I used to read to him, which was kind of great. My mom was an elementary school teacher, and not only did was I always encouraged to read, but I was also encouraged to write things down. My mom used to say that all the time. I'd have some kind of experience, and she'd go write it down. Write down. So I was actually writing at an early age. Uh, and I think getting used to that and getting used to looking at the world, sort of observing the world around me, and observing it and putting it into context. And even though I'm talking about of course, when you're a kid, very crude form, but even so, just doing that, I think it makes you see things a little differently and they leave a bigger impression on you, I think, because I've always been able to recall details about stuff that had happened, many years before. Like here's an example. 1972, New Year's Day, my friend Jeff Chamberlain and I in Santa Cruz surfed this epic day at a place called Privates. And back then it was kind of not a secret spot, but kind of a private spot. We had to hike to it. We surfed this epic day. I found an old black and white print he had made from up on the cliff of that day. And I sent it to him. And I wrote down on it New Year's Day, 1972, Santa Cruz. And he goes, "God, how did how do you remember what day it was?" I go, "Jeff, remember what day it was? I remember the song that was playing on your radio while we were getting out of our wetsuits at the end of the session. It was James Taylor, 'Don't Let Me Be Lonely Tonight.'" And he laughed and he said, "At your age, I don't think you have to worry too much about dementia right now,
Yeah.
because,
So
but for some reason, that memory was really seared into my consciousness. And,
I,
it's
I
about
wonder, I wonder if there's a hereditary component to it as well. Be, there's certain people like in my interviewing over the years, um, Dick Metz,
oh,
he's in his
yeah,
he's in his 90s. He'll
yeah,
tell me stories from his when he was a teenager. And
yeah.
I guess there's nobody there to fact check it, I suppose. So maybe he is making it up, but he gets enough of the details correct to where I
Yeah.
do believe him. Or I was talking to Bob McTavish at the
Oh,
boardroom
he's
show.
he's sharp.
It's crazy. He was
Yeah.
like talking about meeting Rennie Yater when they were in their early 20s. And he was talking about visiting him in Santa Barbara. And he was mentioning the street names. Like, oh, yeah, I remember you turn on this street and that street. And I'm like, I've been to Santa Barbara. I've been to that shop. I don't remember the street names, and I'm 40. Obviously, Kelly Slater always is like recalling heats from his amateur
Oh,
career
yeah,
and he knows the scores
yeah,
and stuff.
yeah, yeah.
So there's a few people who have witnessed that do it, but I'm always impressed by it. Makes me want to take better care of my mental health, basically.
You know what's interesting? My brother Matt, even though we've shared a lot of experiences, his memory is terrible. He
Really?
leans on me all the time. When did that happen? Gosh, we haven't been there in 20 years. I'll go, "No, Matt, that was 40 years, not 20
Yeah.
years. And that was
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
1976. So
Yeah.
it's interesting how even in the same family, it can it
S-
can be different.
So not to belabor this, but do you do anything to preserve mental acuity, like supplements, diet, whatever? Sudoku?
No,
Okay.
I would say I live an extremely healthy lifestyle, you know, and they've shown that, exercise and fitness plays a huge role in, mental acuity, especially as you get older, at a certain age. But I will tell you this, it's my own form of, I guess not Sudoku, but this is what I do. Sometimes I'll go on Matt Warshaw's Encyclopedia of Surfing website. When you open that site, it has a grid of 50 images of surfers and surfing. Periodically, I go through, I open that up, and I try to name every single person and every single shot of that of all those surfers mostly. Uh, and I really, if I can't remember one, it really bothers me, you know.
Okay. So
So yeah,
what would you say your accuracy is percentage wise?
98, 99, 98%.
Incredible.
No, no,
Incredible.
I miss like I missed it. Not Tim Bryers, who won the U.S. Men's Championship in 1978. It was one of the women surfers, Nerida Falconer. I miss
Hmm.
Nerida Falconer. Yeah. So,
I'll
but
give
for
you
the
that
most
one.
part,
And
for the most part, I'm pretty good.
for listeners who do not go to eos.surf, that grid shifts. If you refresh the page, it's all new imagery and layout
Oh,
too.
it's all
So
new every time.
it's not like you can memorize it.
But you
Um,
know what? You know what? You know who else is really good at this? Is
mm,
Sean Thompson. Now, I'm talking about memories of surfing, of a surfing life. And I think one of the reasons why he's so good at it, as maybe I am in terms of surfing, surf history, is how important Surfer Magazine was to us growing up, both of us. You know, him, isolated in South Africa, me at the time, even though I started reading in Surfer as I was growing up in Hawaii, when I moved to Northern California, Surfer was my window into the surfing world. I think that's one of the reasons why we were both that way. And I remember one night we were eating at the used to be the Seaview Inn in Haleiwa, and there were a bunch of surfers having, during the season, Bernie Baker and Sean and all these people. And we started someone's a challenge someone to a surfing trivia thing, like a surfing trivia. And Sean and I, pretty soon it was just me and Sean, because people would say things like this. They'd go, okay, who won the 1970 67 Duke contest at Sunset? And I'd go, oh, come on. Who put his fin back on when he broke it off in the quarterfinals? And then Sean would go, okay, but who glassed that board? And then everyone else would just look and we go, okay, leave them. They're on the
that is
was so easy,
incredible.
you know.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
incredible.
oh no, you know what it was? It was who shaped Nat Young's Magic Sam that he won the '66 world title on. And then I said, hey, who makes the fin? And Sean knew it was a 14-year-old Randy Rarick.
Oh
So
wow.
it's like,
Okay.
yeah. So anyway, but that's memory. And yeah, so to me, it's like, I don't know, it's just the richness of experience that really is all we have, I
Totally.
mean, stories is all we have. It's all we're left with at the end of the path here. All we're left with is our stories, nothing
Completely.
else really. And so, that sort of protecting that experience, at least in your memory and in recall, it's I think it's really important, and it's especially important uh, to a storyteller, whatever
Totally.
the medium is.
Yeah. Well, when I look at your timeline of your childhood, um, it looks like you were never anywhere for more than 3 years or so at a time. I'm just
Yeah, no,
curious if I'm just curious if you identify anywhere as home of your youth.
it's hard to say, like you said, because my dad was in the Navy in the early days. We traveled all the time. Um, really the longest I've ever lived anywhere is in this last period of my life. I lived over 18 years in Malibu, in West Malibu. Now, I'm not from Malibu, uh, but it was really after so much traveling and living in so many different places, it just something about it, it felt like home.
Hmm.
I can't call it my home because we used to say if you didn't go to high school in that town, that's not your hometown,
Yeah.
you know? And so, but
S-
yeah, I really probably felt most at home in Malibu, strangely enough, although my spiritual center is San Francisco.
Is it really?
Something about growing up there and having to forge a surfing lifestyle there, which was not easy, and just how beautiful it is. And then I lived there again in the 90s, and just something about that formative period in high school, living in the Bay Area and then, San Francisco, having a relationship with that city. I still feel a real intrinsic connection to San Francisco. Because
I mean,
trust me, growing up as a 14-year-old surfing Ocean Beach with no full suits and no leashes, you had to love it, you know.
well, the city itself too, I mean, has changed so drastically. I'd be curious if you went back now, if you feel, um, I don't know, dismayed by the way that it's developed.
I've had my friends, that are there and they've talked about that and stuff. Um, but change is constant.
Yeah.
And for some people now, this is what they know now. I mean, uh, I sort of created my own life there. Like, for example, in the early 90s, my then wife was going to grad school up there, and we lived in the Marina District right down by the water. And I mean, it was glorious. I'd walk across the street with my paddleboard and paddle out and do a loop around the Golden Gate Bridge. And I could ride my bike up and surf Fort Point and stuff. And that was glorious, you know. Way sort of a much, I mean, I had a much better experience in San Francisco then than in 1970 when, San Francisco was kind of scruffy back then, you
Totally.
know,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and the young people too. I said, we were living back there during the Zodiac killer days. You didn't want to go walk with your girlfriend on the beach at night.
Wow.
Those were there were Zodiac killers. There were two serial killers operating at the same time in Santa Cruz. Washed up on the beach in Capital where we used to surf. I mean, I didn't see it, but um, it was scruffy back then a little bit. So I don't know. If I went back today, I think I'd still be able to find the essence of what I loved about San Francisco.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm curious, I know you went to college for a bit before dropping out and studied or not surf journalism,
Well,
but journalism.
wait, technically I didn't drop out. I was asked to leave. There is a difference there. Yeah. So
Okay,
the
so
big difference.
two questions for you then.
Sure.
Um, what did your parents expect of you professionally, or did they have any expectations for you? What were your personal ambitions professionally? And then why were you asked to leave?
Okay, I'll do the first one. I'll answer the first one. I felt absolutely no expectations from my parents ever. My dad was a very unconventional military man. I personally think that he only got in the military because he had a growing up he craved a certain level of status. And I think that being because like for example, he wanted to fight in World War II as an aviator. And by the time he actually got to do that, the war was winding down. He never got to see service, even though he flew off aircraft carriers and stuff. But he liked that status. So after the Navy, he got out of school, went to college, got a medical degree, but he missed the status. And so he went back into the Navy. But he was a very unconventional Navy man. He was sort of like Hawkeye and MASH. He wasn't uptight, a rigid disciplinarian, typical military guy. He had no intentions of us ever following him into the military. Matter of fact, during the Vietnam War, I actually had to register for the draft. At the very end of the Vietnam War, I still was of an age where I had to register. And he said, Sam, they drafted you, or they even tried to draft you. I'm moving you to France, and you're going to go to college in Europe. You're never going to Vietnam. So he was
Wow.
kind of unconventional. Um, and he had this saying, which was pretty interesting. And this is back in the 70s. He used to, talking about future, he used to tell us, you know what, kids, whatever your bag is, just whatever your bag is. And I thought that's a pretty enlightened way of. And then the ironic thing is later when Matt and I were both working for surf magazines and traveling around the world and doing stuff, then he changed to, how the hell are you guys operating out there? And I said, well, Dad, you told us this was our bag, you know? So I never felt
Yeah.
any expectations from him. Now, in terms of professional or career wise, all I want to do is surf. You
Yeah.
know, I didn't know what, I just wanted to surf, you know? Um, I was a bad student because I was indifferent to things that I wasn't interested in. When we lived in Europe, we actually lived in Europe when I was in first grade. And the school I went to, I had 4 people in my class, and the curriculum there was very advanced compared to, I mean, first graders in America were doing finger painting. In first grading, I was doing drawings with line and perspective. I still remember the thing I did. I had to draw telephone poles going off in the distance behind hills. That's in
Wow.
first grade. We took tours of art museums, you know.
Yeah.
So by the time I got back to America, I, school seemed boring to me, you know. Uh, so anyway, that carried on all the way through high school. I didn't have enough good grades because I wanted to go to San Diego and be sponsored by Gordon and Smith and Surf La Jolla Shores. That was the sort of pinnacle of my ambition. That's all I wanted. I just want to get sponsored by GNS and Surf La Jolla Shores, you know,
That's so
because after
funny.
surfing Ocean Beach, can you imagine La Jolla Shores, gentle, beautiful 3 foot beach break, warm,
Yeah.
some of the warmest water in California. So anyway, I had a really meaning and dedicated high school counselor who called every California state college and or state university and said, "Hey, I've got this bright student. His grades don't match up, but he's really a writer. He's worked on the newspaper. I think you would enjoy having him in your journalism department." And the only school that would take me of the whole system was Cal Poly San Luis Obispo because they had a real small journalism department. So they said, "Yeah, we'll take him." And so luckily, I got to get out of the Bay Area and I moved down to San Luis Obispo to go to college.
It's an amazing place to live.
Yeah, it was. And like I said, even though that my dream was La Jolla Shores, uh, one of my best friends, Jeff Chamberlain, who was a hugely influential character in my life, he had started going there the year before. I had surfed in that area for about 2 years at that time. And so it was great. It affected my life in ways that I didn't appreciate as much then, but later I really did appreciate. But unfortunately, my so-called college career, after about a year and a half, or maybe 2/3 the way through my junior year, I got called to the dean of students' office, and they said, "Mr. George, we've been looking at your transcripts here, and we see that you get A's and F's, and you're what we call an indifferent student." He goes, "But our college is growing, and there's a lot of students and young people that really want to come here and they want to go to school here. And you're just taking up space." So they said, "I like to suggest, Mr. George, that you step aside and make room for someone that really wants to go to college." And I said, "Sir, that's the best advice an adult has ever given me." And I jumped on my skateboard and I rode away on my brand new Cadillac wheels. And that was it. That was the end of my so-called college career.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that they did you a favor?
Oh, certainly. I was just taking up space, you
Yeah.
know. I mean,
Yeah,
I
no, I
didn't
mean,
even like the journalism. All they wanted to teach you was how to write for newspapers. To them, the pinnacle achievement was writing for the Fresno Bee. But the one
gotcha.
thing I learned in school, in college, and it ironically, for such an indifferent student, it really, you know, benefited me, was I learned how to write a lead sentence. Because in newspaper writing, you got to catch people right off the bat. And I learned how to write a provocative, informative lead sentence. And that I never forgot that. And I've used it in every other thing I've ever written, every documentary I've ever done, every interview I've ever done. And I realized, you know, thanks, Cal Poly. You know,
Yeah,
you asked
very
me to
good.
leave, but I left with a little kernel of wisdom.
Absolutely, yeah. Um, how are you funding surf travel, or were you traveling much through those years?
Okay, now that's an interesting story. Like I said, that's all we have is our stories. All I wanted to do was surf Burley Heads. I wanted to go to Australia so bad. My aunt was from Australia, married my mother's brother. And so from a very young age, I was exposed to the whole concept of Australia. Waltzing Matilda was my favorite song when I was a little kid. So I wanted to go to Burley. And you know, I decided that I actually made the decision in San Luis Obispo. I was actually mucking out a barn on the outskirts of town that had chew mail pouch tobacco on the roof. And my wife at the time was taking care of some horses there. And I was literally mucking out manure when I said, you know what? I'm going to become a professional surfer. I'm going to join the WSA. I'm going to qualify for the US championships. I'm going to win this division and I'm going to get sponsorship. And I'm going to go to Australia. So it, I came so close to making that happen. And I would say that's one of the only times in my life I've ever shown any ambition. But the problem was I didn't get the sponsorship to go to Australia. Luckily for me, hired at the surf shop where I worked was a wonderful young woman named Anna Trent. She was the daughter of the legendary big wave rider Buzzy Trent. And she had moved to the Central Coast and she was going to eventually marry a great guy. They're a really good surfer. She worked at the shop. When I told her of my ambition, she said, look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call my uncle Bud, who was Bud Brown, who made the very first surf movie in 1958. She goes, I'm going to call my uncle Bud and see if he'll give you one of his movies at cost so you can show the movie and you'll make sure to make money. You'll get a profit. So he sent kindly, Bud Brown sent me Going Surfing, which is one of the best movies of the 70s. And I scrapped together what little money I had. I rented the VFW hall in San Luis Obispo, rented a projector, went up and put posters up on all the telephone poles. And I screened Going Surfing at the Vets Hall. And because he gave it to me a discount, I made enough money, just enough to get my ticket to Australia. So that was really my first, self-funded surf trip that way, you know. Uh, but
Incredible.
after that, it was just scrapping, just getting by. So
Do you remember how much you sold tickets for or what you made?
those tickets were 250. But back then in like that era, everyone would come to a surf movie.
Okay.
And here's the great part about that. There was a full range war going on at the time in the Central Coast. The original, mostly Pismo Beach locals, they hated the newcomers that came there to go to school. I wouldn't have changed it, but I made a huge mistake. The first year I got there, they held the Central Coast Surfing Championships at Morro Bay. Well, I entered it, and all the local guys entered it too. They were going to show all these new people coming up from LA. That's what they assumed everyone was from LA that moved there. They were going to show them. Well, the first day it was 6 to 8 foot, and on their 7.6 pintails, there were some really good surfers, and they did really well. Well, I did pretty good too. Eventually, I got to the finals. Well, they had to hold it on consecutive weekends. So the second weekend, it was 2 to 3 foot and offshore. Pretty little waves, but these guys were mostly like big wave, these guys surf big rough waves. Well, in the parking lot was a guy I met at school, an older guy, and he had a Jacobs Lance Carson 9.6 on his car. And I said, hey, Bobby, let me borrow that board. Because I'd never, even through the whole thing, I'd always ridden longboards now and then just for fun. I was pretty good on them. So I took the longboard out and I was walking the nose and doing things. I did coffin rides. I stood on my head, and because the waves were tiny and these guys on their pintails, they were struggling. Well, I won. Okay, so that was it. I was public enemy number one, and all the ire and all the anger that they felt for all these newcomers, they focused on me. So that was tough. I had some tough times back then. But the best part was when I showed that movie, every surfer in the county came, and every one of those guys that waxed my windshields and stuff like that, they all lined up and they put that money in my hand and I put it in that little gray box, those little like a Girl Scout selling cookies. And I just put that money in every time. Hey guys, thanks for coming. They never knew they were buying my ticket to Australia. So
Amazing.
that was, I got a little bit of
The
payback there.
that element of public enemy number one, I would imagine just from moving around a lot when you were a kid, and especially probably being in Hawaii when you were in Hawaii, um, you would have to become accustomed to that.
It is true. I mean, I was, I've, at several prominent breaks, I've worked my way up to the top of the food chain. Never the complete top because I didn't go to high school there, but I worked my way up to the top, but never, you know, and I used to think, God, I used to envy the guys that were from there, that they had that peer group. I never had a peer group. I was always, it was, well, when we were younger, I didn't have that. On the Central Coast, there was a group of us that we surfed together. That was a little different because we weren't the main group. We weren't the upper echelon, but I never really had a peer group, even though I could finally work my way into the lineup. And I used to envy the guys that had that thing, that they had that peer group. But yeah, no, I faced a lot of intimidation. I mean, in Hawaii, it's just natural. Growing up and eventually being good enough to surf, Kaisers or Koala Basin, you just knew you didn't take waves, you took scraps, and that's
Yeah.
fine, you just accepted that, you know. Uh, San
I
Francisco, there were no other surfers my age then when I moved there. I mean, when you're
yeah,
14, a 19-year-old surfer, he's old, you know? And so that
totally.
was tough. Or when we first started surfing Fort Point, um, first few times we surfed it alone. First time we paddled out where a bunch of the hardcore guys were out and they get out of here. All of a sudden we're going, wait, we thought this was fun spot. We learned, oh, you it's someone else's spot, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I had
yeah.
to deal with a lot of it, you know?
Well,
Uh,
it's
I had
interesting.
to
I
learn
think,
how to assimilate into lineups. I had to learn,
yeah,
learn how to
exactly.
do it.
And the other detail is I think kids need stability to a certain degree. And you can, even if you're moving around, you can have that because your parents are stable and they're unconditionally loving. You know what I mean? So the moving around part doesn't create a chaos in your life by just uh, necessarily. It may not, but I have to imagine that the adventurous spirit that you have now and the having surfed in 42 countries definitely was embedded in the childhood, by the moving around that
Oh
you
yeah.
did.
Well, especially the travel experience. I mean, you know, I moved. My dad got stationed in France, on a ship, and he decided I don't want to leave you guys for 3 years. I'm moving you over there. And so we moved at the time, my brother, Matt, my older sister, Julie, and my mom, we moved to France and we went by ship. You couldn't afford to fly. We went by ship. And can you imagine what an exciting experience that is for a first grader? I mean, I saw a volcano erupting at sea in the Azores, you know. I mean, Matt and I actually got lost for a few minutes on the waterfront in Casablanca as little kids. You know, I had these incredible experiences traveling like that. And on the weekends, we would take trains to whatever port my father was at and visit him in these ports all throughout the Mediterranean. And so that really instilled in me that the world was a wondrous place.
Yeah.
And I think that had a lot to do with how the direction my surfing life took, that more than anything else, it was driven by surf travel. A lot of people don't realize that because they know me from working at the magazine, writing articles, um, later in life, thanks to my collaboration with Stacy Peralta, doing documentary films, things like that. They don't, it doesn't register that the driving force in my surfing life has been travel.
Yeah.
And another person that was responsible for that was the friend I met earlier. His name's Jeff Chamberlain. When I moved to California, he and his brother, they had just tried surfing once at a summer vacation up at Bodega Bay, north of San Francisco. They became surfers really quickly because they met another surfer. And we had this little, 3-man crew basically. Well, Jeff was way different than me. All he cared about was what was up around the corner.
Mm.
Surfing regular main breaks was never enough for him. It was always, let's look around. If it's good here, let's look there. And I went on my very first surf trip with him, which was a trip up to Bodega Bay, north of San Francisco, from the East Bay. That was my first surf trip. And he was played really influential in my life because without that kind of inspiration coming from him, I probably could have just moved to Santa Cruz and surfed Steamer Lane all the time.
Yeah.
But instead we were scouring every little place, from 5 mile to 4 mile to 3 mile to up the coast. And then that just sort of carried on to where I dreamed of that kind of life of surf travel. And somehow I manifested it.
Do you remember the very first article that you had published in a surf magazine?
Yes, and matter of fact, I just wrote an article about the first article a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
But here's the interesting thing. I wrote a story and I didn't get a byline on it. It was just a little short little sidebar about the hot Californians in Hawaii in season 1979 or something. But the first byline story I wrote was called How I Lost the OP Pro. And it was a self-deprecating kind of satire on professional surfing. And it really was something very different running in, I think it was 1980, let me see, it might have been like 82 maybe. But it was something very different. And they got letters like, what is this? Because at the time, everyone in professional surfing, including the sponsors and competitors, they were taking themselves so seriously. And I wrote a humor piece called How I Lost the OP Pro. And I was thinking about that because I was watching some of the coverage of the World Championship Tour and how surfers in it, even the surfers in it, they're always complaining all the time. They're complaining about judging and they're complaining about, the surf, we should have held it here or this and that. And I was thinking, my gosh, surfers have been complaining about contests. And I thought, well, I'm going to go back and look at that article I wrote about my mishaps back then. So I went back and I read it. It really held up pretty well. A little rough, but I actually thought it was really kind of funny. And it kind of worked. But the best part about it was after they ran it, they got a comment from Mark Richards, who at the time I think was 3-time world champion. He said, I really liked that story you ran about how I lost the OP Pro. He goes, it made me laugh. It was kind of funny. He goes, it was sort of refreshing to read that take. Because at the time, like I said, everybody was taking themselves seriously. And I was too. I was doing my best to win that heat. I didn't want to get fifth, So yeah, that was the first story that actually had my byline on it.
Kind of a side note, but I dug out of my garage a bunch of surf magazines that I had put in a bin from my youth and just on my first move out of my parents' house, put them in a bin and never really went back to them and finally just unearthed them. And it's everything from all the way back from like the 60s and 70s.
Oh yeah, that's a good issue. Yeah.
All the way through to your era in the early 2000s. I mean, I've got surfer mags here that you were responsible for. But what's interesting is when you do read the articles or the notes to the editor, it's all exactly the same in the 60s that it was in the 80s, that it was in the 90s, that it is now. Like the
It
stuff that
is.
we're
It's
talking about on the podcast, the topics we're trying to come up with each week,
yeah,
I
I
could just
know.
open those and read verbatim,
Yeah,
you
no,
know?
it's true. It's true. You go back and look at those letters to the editor. They're those that was their version of the comment section. Matt Warshaw and I were talking about, we're thinking, do you remember all the letters to the editors we had to read where they had the word fuck in them? You know? Oh, so many,
It'll the letter to the editor will say, it'll be some disgruntled parent going,
Oh yeah.
my kid's reading your magazine. There's pictures of nearly naked women in there. How
Yeah,
dare
I
you?
know.
Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like,
Yeah,
yep,
no, I know.
been around
I
that
know.
argument a million
No,
times.
no, I got them. I got a lot of those. You
It's
know,
so funny.
I got some hilarious ones like that. But yeah, no, we're grateful to have that bi-monthly and then monthly uh, chronicle of our sport. I mean, it's wonderful to, as you can imagine. I mean, I don't have a huge collection of surf magazines. I don't nothing like Matt Warshaw, who's seen everything, or the
Do-
Surfing Heritage Foundation and Cultural Center. It's got every surf magazine ever printed. You know,
yeah. Do
um,
you can you identify or do you feel something is missing from today's surf culture by not having those magazines in circulation anymore?
I've seen enough surfer magazines that I put a lot of sweat and work into in the toilets of scruffy shaping rooms around the world to not really have an overblown opinion of how valuable they are as cultural artifacts. You know what I mean? So I don't, but I do think that surfers today are missing. They are missing something uh, about not having the opportunity to hold it in your hand, you know, to because like I've talked about this with like my brother Matt and other surfers, and I think, do you don't think we would have been stoked to have 24/7 surf movies online to watch all the time? Just to have stuff not wait 3 months to find out who won the Pipe Masters, but actually watch it happen. I go, we would have been just as excited. But they are missing a little something about not being able to hold it in your hand and study it you know,
Yeah.
to really study it. Because yes, you can watch videos of Tom Curran or Mick Fanning or Katie Simmers. You can watch the videos and it's stimulating, really stimulating. But there's something about the image capturing like a peak moment of a maneuver or a wave or an experience. There's something about capturing the image and being able to lose yourself in it and examine it and think about it and come back to it that makes it adds, I think, to the appreciation of what a remarkable thing surfing really is.
That's
If you
key.
if you're just too much always watching it happen instead of considering what happened, you develop a whole different relationship about how you feel about the sport, you know?
I think that is absolutely key, and that's the argument I was going to make for you and for the magazines was if you go to a buffet, it's too much food. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't need crab legs on the same plate as
Yeah.
prime rib as creme brulee. You know what I mean? Like, let's
Yeah.
keep them separate. And the crab legs could be a highlight for a given night or week or month. And
Yeah.
so, and that's what I feel like there's so much high quality surfing that's happening that falls on deaf ears because it's all white noise. And
Yeah.
so the moments of, I remember imagery. It might have been a surfer's journal now that I think about it, but it was like a cover shot of Rob Machado at J Bay doing kind of a backside gecko high line. And
No, I know that was Surfer's Journal.
okay. So
Yeah.
it wasn't the most critical turn. It wasn't like the full spray. It was just the moment in between that if you're scrolling on Instagram, you don't notice the moments in between, but it was beautiful. It was incredibly beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
And so there's taking the time, you're right, but also there was a curation involved back then where
Yeah.
your team and whoever it was before you were experts. and you're like, this isn't good enough to publish, or there's a better version of it that we can publish. And so there was a kind of an elevated art element. And I think that that also comes with a different set of problems. If you have the gatekeeper thing or whatever, it kind of got homogenized to where everything
Yeah.
looked the same and surfing became the same for a while. But there was a moment of time, and I'm grateful to have experienced it, where it was high art and I committed all of that to memory. Like you said earlier, it became like now when I pull this out 30 years later and I look, I'm like, I exactly remember this and the feeling it gave me and what I tried to do after I watched it, or saw it.
No, no, sure. My brother Matt publishes a magazine in Bali called Surf Time, and it is filled with beautiful imagery. And, sometimes we rue the fact that not many people are going to get to see those photos because there is a power in the photo. There really is there's a power of capturing a moment rather than just displaying the whole thing, you know. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I'm certainly, I'm not, I don't look backwards at all. I mean, today's media is today's media, and
Yeah.
it's funny because people talk about, oh, surf culture is dead or surf culture is dying, and I have tried to tell people, no, surf culture is what it is today. Surf culture isn't something that happened; it's something that is today. This
Totally.
is surf culture. So I
Yeah.
don't look backwards. I think there's room for all of it, but there is something really special. And that's something that I don't know if this is a segue or not, but in my upcoming book that's going to be published in April, they said we'd really like to get some really nice, we want to get nice imagery associated with these stories. Do you have images that actually go with these stories? And at first I said, I don't know. I don't know if I do because I've never owned a camera. I'm not, I don't take photos. And a lot of trips I've gone on and some of the sort of, I would say, adventure or misadventure stories included in the book, I wasn't taking photos. But I thought about it and I went through and I really kind of dug into the challenge, and I found a number of really arresting images that work really well with these stories. And it made me realize, how important, even though the story itself can stand alone, having an associated image that is evocative to go along with it. It was a real, it really sort of, heightened the experience, I think, of the story. So, yeah, the photos are, surf photos. I miss the magazine days, but those were the magazine days.
Why did you leave Surfer in 2005?
Here's the thing. I started writing as a correspondent for Surfing Magazine in 82. So by 2005, I've been writing for the surf magazines for a long time. I made a terrible mistake as editor. In my mind, I made a terrible mistake. On our annual big issue, I chose a photo to go on the cover and we were going to run it in black and white. And it was a fantastic photo of the late Tahitian surfer Malik Joyeux. And it was an incredible picture of him at Teupo'o. And it just looked fantastic. And we printed it and it was really great. And about 2 weeks later, the assistant photo editor came in and said, Sam, I need to show you something. I go, what? Showed me an issue of Surfing Magazine. Way in the back, in like some ancillary article, there was that photo. The fact that I didn't know that, when I was working for the magazines, I read every single magazine. I read all the Australian magazines. I read all of Breakout. I read all of the East Coast magazines. I read every magazine because I was steeped in that world. And I realized to myself that I stopped looking at Surfing Magazine. And I said, you know what? If if I should be fired for this.
Mm.
You know, if I had been in charge of me, I would have fired me. And it really bothered me. Now, at the same time, incredibly, for the first time, I met John Severson, the founder of Surfer Magazine back in 1960. I had never met him. I'd corresponded with him several times. I'd even sent him a gift once, but I'd never met him. And I said, Mr. Severson, I'm so honored to meet you. I can't believe it. It took this long. And we started talking. And I said, Mr. Severson, you only worked at Surfer for 9 years. Like what? Why did you leave? And he said, well, the eras were changing and the sport was changing. And I'd kind of done what I could do with it.
Hmm.
And I said, and then I started talking to him a little bit about my problem. And I told him about my mistake. And I said, I can't believe I hate the thought that I could ever be jaded, that I'm so jaded that I'm mailing it in, so to speak. And he goes, Sam, and I would admit he was being complimentary. He goes, we've never met, but I've been watching you and I've been monitoring you over the years. And I'm saying, you know what? Surfer was in good hands with you and you did a good job. He goes, but I think what you're experiencing now is you're not jaded. He goes, you're sated. You've had enough. You've had enough of the meal. He goes, you're sated. You're not jaded. You're still excited. I can tell, but you've kind of had enough. And at the same time, Stacy Peralta, an old friend of mine, came to me, and that's a whole nother story about the genesis of riding giants. But at the time, so I had the mistake. I had John Severson saying, you're okay. And I had Stacy saying, well, could I hire you to help me with this? And I realized, you know what? Maybe it is time for me to step away and start looking at expressing myself in a new medium, which was documentary film. So that's a long answer to your question, but that's
Not
why I left Surfer. Yeah,
not long at all. And
it was a confluence. Thank God for John Severson and Stacy.
no, but I see a lot of people overstaying their welcome in a lot of different ways, like I always commend somebody who recognized Jerry Seinfeld going out on top, or even Carissa Moore recently,
Yeah,
just opting to opt out because she knows like motherhood is a
yeah,
wonderful way of life and I want to pursue that.
sure.
So many people live in the heyday of when they were at their peak, but
Yeah.
it's wonderful to see somebody evolve and then have another peak, basically.
Yeah, and actually, it didn't happen in a week. I put out some great issues after that, but it was with that awareness
Yeah,
that I was that I was that it was time for me to pass it off to someone else and step aside, and step forward, not aside. So,
right.
but yeah, that's why I left Surfer. I mean, I you know, I was really satisfied with the work. I loved the people I worked with, and I worked with some great young creative people. And matter of fact, Joni Casimiro, the art director who I worked with during my entire tenure as editor in chief, she designed the cover of my book.
So let's do that segue. What was the impetus for the book?
Well, the main impetus was I had heard so many times over the years, wow, you should write a book. Now here I was somebody that I expressed perspectives. I wrote stories about other people. I helped them express their perspectives. I interviewed people, for over 20 years, 25 years, But I realized after a while, I've hardly ever told my stories. My stories I've told on the decks of Mentawai charter boats, or long drives, in Baja and stuff, and around the fire, that's where I've been telling my stories. And enough enough people said, you should write your own stories. And, you know, so I started writing some of these stories, and I started collecting articles that I'd written that I thought were exceptional, I mean, exceptional being for me, that I was proud of. And then I started writing about things that I hadn't written about. Many years ago, I'd embarked on a book project where I'd written some chapters, but it was never finished, never published. I went back and looked at those and thought, wow, I could tell this story better now.
Mm.
So I started writing the stories and I started collating them, and I started thinking, wow, I've got a pretty neat collection here. I started showing them to friends and family, and they all said sort of the same thing. They go, Sam, this is great. You know, Now, at the same time, my brother Matt got a book published. I think you interviewed him about it, an incredible book about, 35 years or whatever of his magazine writings. And I mean, I was so impressed with that, even though I lived through it all with him, to see it collated into a volume. It just accentuated that he is easily the most, you know, I think the most talented surf writer ever. Uh, Certainly during a certain period in the 80s, nobody even came close to Matt. And no one's ever come as close to Matt in writing profiles. you know. I mean, nobody else but Matt would go live on the commune with Shane Horan and the vegetarian dogs to do a profile of Shane. Nobody would have gone to profile Bo Young and had the guts to ask him, when your dad was getting beaten up in that parking lot, you were watching. Why didn't you jump in? Why didn't you step in to help? Matt was the only guy with the nerve to do that. Um, so anyway, he had had this book published and they were having a post-release party, and we were at the party and we were talking, and there were some of their other writers there from the publisher, and pretty soon I got to telling stories too, or having a great time. And the publisher said, "Gee, Tim, do you have any stories of your own?" And matter of fact, yeah, I kind of do. They go, "Well, we'd like to sell them." So I submitted a few, and they said, "Wow, yeah, we want to publish your book too." So that's kind of how it started. It was um, but here's the interesting thing. As I advanced into the process of the book, the articles that I'd previously written and that were published, I started culling them from the collection, because writing for a magazine is totally different than if you're writing, as I call my book, is called a memoir in progress, because I'm not at the end yet. But I realized that for the original work, I was being much more retrospective. I was writing from a position of greater self-awareness than I did some of the magazine articles. Some of them are funny, and they're great, but a lot of the ones I cut them out until I think there's 23 stories. Only a few were previously published in surf magazines. That was sort of an interesting sort of development, because at first I thought, oh, I've got some great articles I wrote. I mean, I wrote a really funny story called Surfing and Sex. And it was all about, like I said, some people think surfing, the statement I made is, people say, what do is surfing like sex? And I go, what are you talking about? Surfing is sex, and it was a really funny story. And when they did a compilation of Surfer magazine writings, Chris Morrow and Steve Hawk put together a compilation. They chose that story to put in that compilation. Well, I went back and looked at it. I go, yeah, it's a funny story, but it's not about, it wasn't as, it was a personal expression, but it wasn't that sort of personal expression.
Gotcha.
So basically what I was left with, and I don't mean to drop names here, but a few weeks ago, I was snowboarding with Jerry Lopez at Mount Bachelor. I actually wrote an article about that called "Kooking Out in Front of Jerry Lopez." It was a humiliating experience. That's a whole nother story. But the point is, I was on the lift line with the great man, and I said, "Yeah, I've actually got a book coming out, in April." He goes, "Oh, really?" He goes, "What's it about?" And I thought about it for a second, and I didn't have a pat answer. And I finally just said, "It's all about me." It really is all about me, you know? And he laughed, and I said, but it is. It's kind of all about me. Now, do I write about other people? Yes. I write about my mother. It's one of the most powerful stories in the book, and also one of the most uh, profound for me to write. I write about my relationship with John Milius, the writer director who did Big Wednesday, and of course, a number of other things. I write about that. I write about the four amazing Indonesian women that Matt and I worked with doing relief after the tsunami in 2004, 2005. I write about other people, but it's about my experience with those people. I write about sharing a wave with Walter Becker from Steely Dan on a reef break in Fiji. Okay, that come on, that doesn't pop up all that often. So yeah, there's other people in it, but I really thought about it. I said, yeah, it's all about me, Jerry. And he
Hmm.
laughed. And so from then on, he would say, so when does that book that's all about you come out? So we laughed about it. But
Does
yeah, it's all about me.
does Walter Becker surf well?
No, doesn't surf at all.
Oh, okay.
That was no, that it's a really funny story, I have to admit, uh, because uh, I didn't know who he was at first. He was married to a really well-known, well-respected female surfer from Kauai, and I ran into them serendipitously in Fiji on the Coral Coast at a little sort of resort where there's a really good hollow wave out front called. And I could tell she was a really good surfer. And I'm not going to tell the whole story too, but I could tell she was the surfer of the group, of their family. And so when you could only surf in the morning before it blew out in the afternoon. So I said, oh, waves I was there all by myself. It was lonely surfing those waves. So I was so happy to have another surfer there. So I said, no, no, it's going to be really good in the morning. Her name was Eleanor. Great, great, great lady. I said, you're going to love it. It's a really fun wave. You're going to love it. So in the morning, I show up, she shows up, and there her husband shows up, long hair, scraggly, wearing a rash guard, baggy trunks, and a boogie board under his arm and swim fins. And we're 100 yards from the ocean. He's got his fins on already. And I'm just going, what the hell is he going to do? Sure enough, he kicked out into the lineup. And if you want to find out what happened, uh, you can read the book. But
Gotcha.
the funny part is when I said, I, she goes, Eleanor at one point goes, no, he'll be okay. He only took up boogie boarding just recently. We were back east, in the Hamptons, and we were back there for an award show, and he picked up boogie boarding, and I kind of went, award show, because to myself I thought he was a Maui pot dealer. You guys traveling around the way you are with your baby and a Brazilian nanny. I figured he was a drug dealer or a pot dealer. I didn't tell her that. I go, a word show? What kind of word show? She goes, a music word show. And I went, music awards, New York. I looked in and all of a sudden I looked at him. I said, is that Walter Becker? And she goes, yeah, you've heard of him? And I just went, what do you mean? Have I heard of him? Are you kidding? So that was how I met Walter Becker. And
That's
that story
funny.
and how it played out and everything. That's one of the stories. And that actually ran in Surfing Magazine, a version of it. I went back and looked at it and I rewrote it a little bit. But that's
Um,
one of the stories that's in there. So
I don't know if this made the cut for the book, but can you tell me about the time you gave Josh Brolin a wetsuit?
oh no, Josh has said in interviews, I was his first sponsor. Because I worked at a venerable surf shop in Santa Barbara called Surf and Wear, and Josh Brolin was a hot little surfer, you know, and he was part of this crew in Montecito. They called themselves the Cedo Rats, and they would surf like Miramar Point, or on smaller days they'd surf Hammonds. But they were this hot crew, and O'Neill was doing these promos with this new kind of rubber, a new kind of it wasn't neoprene, it was a new kind of wetsuit insulation material, and they weren't really made for really cold water, but they wanted to see what people thought about them. So at the shop, they gave us a bunch in different sizes, and they said, "Hey, pass these out to some of the people in your community." And so we put the word out, and a few of the Cedo rats showed up at the shop. And so I said, "Here, Josh, got him an O'Neill wetsuit." And it's funny he remembered that all those years later.
That
And
is
the
funny.
great thing about that was that many years later, um, I approached Josh and asked him to do the narration of the documentary I did for ESPN, the film Hawaiian, The Legend of Eddie Aikau. And Josh still surfed, not as often as he used to, but he still was a surfer. He was stoked. And so I got to direct Josh Brolin for for Hawaiian, The Legend of Eddie Aikau. So it all kind of came full circle.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great story. I didn't
Yeah.
realize that he surfed when he was young. I just figured he was a celebrity who got into it later in life, because he lived near the
Oh
water or
no,
something like that.
no, skating and surfing. When he was a kid, he was a good surfer. He was a good hop.
That's cool.
He wasn't Tom Curran or Chris Brown, but he was a good little surfer. So
Very good.
yeah.
Just a production note. I've got 20 minutes until I've got to bail, so I'm going to
Okay.
roll into some wrap-up questions.
Okay.
But I'm curious, what surf media do you follow at this point?
You know, because you know, even through the documentary film period that when I sort of segued out of the magazines, um, I still started. I started doing a lot of work for Surfline. I was doing a lot of writing for Surfline back when they had editorial content. They naturally, as their forecasting abilities became far and technical, offerings became more and more advanced, they kind of shifted away from editorial content. But for a number of years, they had editorial content, and I really enjoyed it. I did some really good work for them. Um, so yeah, I stayed involved looking at any of the surfing websites. Then I started uh, producing work for the inertia.com, which I do a lot of work for them. So I've got to keep up. So I look at, I follow, well, let me put it this way. I look, I occasionally, I take some kind of nausea medicine, and I look at beach grit. And then I follow, well, now surfermagazine.com does a
Yeah.
great job. They're doing a really good job. Of course, I read the Surfer's Journal, which is one of the last printed magazines. Um, I I follow surfers. Like, I really enjoy anything from Kai Lenny
Mhm.
on YouTube, and I even enjoy his conversations, his blogs with his brother,
Yeah.
and then Nathan Florence, anything with Bob McTavish. So I go on YouTube, and so I like to, and of course I probably watch a good portion, or at least the highlights of every championship tour event.
Do you?
Yeah, I like to see what's going on. I like to stay informed and stay current, because I'm still really involved in the sport.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm writing about it every week,
Right.
you know.
What can you identify the best surfing that you've ever seen?
It's that's always a tough question to answer, because if you want to say the best surfing you've ever seen personally, like witnessing, you know, that's a different question than the best surfing you've ever seen in a movie or on video, you know. Um, but if Surfer's Journal has a little thing that they print in the back of the magazine, the best I ever saw,
Yeah.
you know. And it's kind of neat, because it's not always Tom Carroll's snap at Pipeline, which was one of the most startling, extraordinary thing that I've ever seen personally, and that startled everyone. No one has ever done a turn like that since.
Mhm.
People completely, they don't appreciate what he did. You have never seen since then a front side turn like that in Sirius Pipeline.
Nobody's been built like he's built
No,
since.
that's true. That's true. But nobody has matched that in terms of impact and startling.
Yeah.
But that's what I like about the Surfer's Journal thing. What's the best you ever saw? And to me, I would have to say the best surfing I ever saw. Well, there's a lot of Tom Curran, because I spent a lot of time, growing with Tommy as he was growing up and traveling, and also with Dave Parmenter. So I had two of the best surfers in the world that I spent a lot of time with and a lot of travel time, both totally different types of surfers. But I remember Dave and I spent a lot of time at Jeffreys Bay together on several different trips. On this one trip, Dave had a board he made just for Jeffreys Bay. And when I saw it, it was a really radical wing pintail with a big center fin and two side fins. And I said, "Oh God, talk about a widowmaker, you know." And that board eventually he would call it the Widowmaker. He had a 6'9" Widowmaker that he made for that trip. Now, Dave was one of those surfers. He would never surf a conventional lineup. I don't think he ever has, except in a contest. So not even at J Bay would he surf the Super Tubes lineup. He would go up to Boneyards and sit there by himself and wait for a half an hour to get the one big set wave that would connect him all the way through Super Tubes. And it used to bug the locals because they wanted to surf with him. He was a top pro surfer at the time. But I remember one day, I remember it so clearly. It was a cold, kind of rainy day, gray offshore wind, maybe, 8 to 10 foot faces. And I was out at Super Tubes and it was perfect. Dave was all alone, way up at Boneyards, which is way outside, a couple hundred yards maybe outside the Super Tubes lineup, sitting there by himself. He gets a big set wave out there and he starts powering his way down towards Super Tubes. You're talking about that high line of Machados there. On that board, the single fin with the side bites, the pintail, he could come off the bottom and track along the top of the wave so high and take that turn so far out on the lip and then drop down and then do it again. And the guys at Super Tubes, good surfers, they were just watching him going, he's going to make it all the way through here. He comes charging into Super Tubes from behind Super Tubes and then just carves into Super Tubes, passes everybody, goes down into the next section. I assumed, he told me, got a long barrel, rode to where it closed out, just straightened off, got back to the beach and just walked home. And I just thought that was one of the best statements of surfing I've ever seen. He just completely put his stamp on a A+ black diamond break. Didn't the locals were stoked to watch what he was doing. And then at the end of that ride, he went home. So I would say that's the best surfing I've ever seen.
Great one.
Yeah, it was
Have you
epic.
have you maintained contact with him?
Dave and I, we sort of we went our different ways for a while, but we came back into each other's sphere. And yes, we have an epistolary relationship. We send letters back and forth all the time. And I just did an article about him on the Inertia about
Oh,
he's the
okay.
father of the modern mid length, and people don't even know it.
I met up with him a few years ago in Hawaii and had a really fun session with him on those PSVs that he makes,
Oh
those
yeah,
paddle surf
yeah,
vehicles.
oh yeah.
And he took me to this spot that is kind of perfect for that. And I guess people probably foil it now, but there wasn't any
Salt pond.
foiler. Yeah.
Yeah, salt pond.
Yeah. I wasn't going to say it, but
Oh, come on, it's not a secret spot.
I
Are you
don't know.
kidding?
I don't
It's
want to, I
like,
never want to piss off the locals, even if it's not a
oh,
secret.
come on. No, like you said, it's a foil spot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, also
It's
perfect for the PSVs though, right?
no perfect. And for canoe surfing,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
know?
So he he had that spot dialed. I was just trying to figure it out because there are like little wedges, but they to connect them to a different wedge, you
Yeah,
really have to know where you're going and know how to direct your energy. And so he was getting rides that were like hundreds and hundreds of yards. I wouldn't
yeah,
even see him for like 10
yeah,
minutes,
yeah.
And I was just trying to piece it all together, but it was a blast.
Dave is one of the most extraordinary surfers in history. His ability, his intelligence, his writing, his shaping ability, uh, his wonderful eccentricity. He's really truly one of the greats and completely, in many ways, unappreciated in many ways. But yeah, no, Dave and I, we shared a lot of experiences. He and my brother and I, and we
Yeah.
shared a lot of experiences together. So
Well, what do you do for fitness wise to maintain your surfing life?
I years ago, um, along with a friend, I started doing triathlons in the early '80s. Um, I was always a really fast, good paddler. Um, I was always really good paddler. In high school, I played tennis and I was a springboard diver. But that was the diving part. I just wanted to be in the water. But I started doing triathlons and I started seeing the difference that that made in surfing because at the time I lived in Santa Barbara and, you know, I competed with, 90 people every day at Rincon, and being able to paddle really fast, and I had made a decision I was never, ever going to ride in front of anybody ever. So I had to be a good paddler and I had to, I started paddling. And then in about 84, I started paddleboard racing. Uh, Once again, I thought, gosh, if you want to be a better surfer, you got to be a better paddler. You spend most of your time paddling. So I started paddleboard racing. And then a particular race, I did really well in the races, but at this one particular race, I was sort of this big lifeguard guy from like Laguna Beach. He was kind of not drafting me, but staying really close to me. And I thought, well, this is fine. When we get to that last sprint to the beach, I'll out sprint him. We got to the last sprint. He just paddled away from me. And I realized I was in good shape. He was just stronger than me. So then I started weight training. So I've been weight training and doing gym work since the early 80s. So training has always been a big part of my surfing experience, whether it's paddling, working out at the gym, mountain biking, rock climbing, just sports like that. But specifically, especially now that I'm older, specifically what I do, my training is a combination of resistance weight training, endurance training, and balance. Because you can maintain your strength well into your later years. That's easy. But balance is one of the things that goes pretty quick because a lot of people don't pay attention. So maybe 20 years ago or so, maybe even longer than that, I got one of those Indo boards.
Hmm.
It's like a board on a roller and you roll it back and forth. I used to use that all the time. And now I do a lot of stuff on what are called Bozu balls. I don't know if you know what those are, but
Yeah.
they're like a domed ball with a hard bottom. Well, I turn it over so that the hard part's on top. And I do a timed one leg balance, work on the Bozu ball, but I also do what I call surf squats because when you think about it, all modern surfing, it's all based on squatting and then releasing, you know, power release. So I do a lot of balance work on the Bozu ball where I stand on it like I'm getting barreled at Kaisers, not standing up in 20-foot tubes, but like I'm riding perfect 3-foot Kaisers. I crouch down, I stand up, I crouch down, I go up. Um, so I do balance work like that, working in with, weight training. And like I said, doing like for example, a lot of different, working out a lot of different muscle groups with no rest in between. So your heart rate stays up real high. It's not designed to bulk up and, and look real big, but what it does, it builds strength and endurance, which really is what you need. Because I did a lot of racing and paddleboard races. I did a lot of stand-up paddleboard races. Um, I, I did pretty well in them, I would usually win my age group, and that was important to me.
Yeah.
So yeah, so those are the kind of training things I do. It's about building strength, balance, and endurance.
You said you live dietary wise a pretty healthy lifestyle earlier. Is there anything that you avoid dietary wise?
Well, I hardly eat any fried food. I try to avoid, I don't eat a lot of red meat. Um, unfortunately, I have a sweet tooth that I can't shake. Periodically, I go off of, I'll go off of ice cream for a while, but for the most part, I eat a well balanced diet. You know, whole grains. I mean, I'm not obsessive about it, but I
Okay.
just eat they normally call a really well balanced diet. I'm trying to, of course, as I'm getting older, trying to add a lot more protein into my diet, which is important to maintain muscle mass. I mean, sometimes I think you could look at my diet and go, well, he's pretty groovy, with his fruit and Greek yogurt and whey protein smoothies in the morning with his seed nut bread and natural peanut butter. When I look at it that way, I go, okay, I'm pretty hippie. But then, if I have to, I'll have a milkshake.
Yeah.
Oh, so
That's
yeah.
just, I think that's a pretty modern diet in Southern California. I know you're not in Southern California anymore, but that's all that stuff's
Well,
norm
for right
now.
now.
Well, I was
Yeah,
going to
no,
ask you that.
it's kind of normal.
I was going to ask you that too. Can you say where you live and why? How'd you end up there?
Well, yeah, currently right now, my girlfriend Cami and I, we moved to an island north of Seattle called Whidbey Island. Her mother died a few years ago, and her father's he's getting older. He's in the early stages of cognitive decline, and we thought, you know what, we should move up there before it accelerates too much, so that he can live in his home as long as he can. And so we moved up here, And you want to talk about being sated? I'd pretty much done all I could do in Malibu. I kind of peaked there the summer before, and I thought, you know what? Maybe it's time to do something like this to think in a way to think about somebody else for a change, for to do that. And it doesn't hurt that we live in this beautiful house on a meadow overlooking the water
Yeah.
on this island north of Seattle. That doesn't hurt. It's incredibly beautiful up here. And I'm living a different kind of water life. There's actually a little surf spot on the island. I don't really surf it.
Yeah.
I've surfed it a few times, but
Um,
it's so rare that I just feel bad for the locals who just live for that little spot. And I think if I went out there, every wave I caught would be a wave that one of those guys doesn't get. So I usually watch it from the beach and talk to the guys. And so it is beautiful up here. And we'll just see how long this period lasts. But it is really nice up here.
I actually traveled up there to interview Drew Campion.
He lives 20 minutes from me.
Yeah.
And Matt
Well,
Warshaw lives in Seattle. So think
yep.
about it. Three former surfer editors live within a 40-mile radius of each other. It's like,
In a
who,
non-surfing
yeah,
location, no less.
yeah, who could figure that out? There's surf over on the peninsula, over on the strait, and there's
You
surf
know what
over.
I mean.
Yeah, no, trust me. I haven't really fully engaged with the surf scene up here. We went and surfed up at Vancouver Island a couple last month, and had a really good time. It was really neat, but I haven't totally fully engaged because, like I tell my friends, they go, "Well, how you doing not surfing every day?" And I said, guys, I've built up so much equity in my surfing that I can afford to live off the interest for a while, you know. So that's the
That-
way I look at it.
I'm glad to hear you say that. That indicates that you are healthy, that you have a healthy perspective on life. Because, I mean, for my 20s to a certain point in my 30s, and I think Matt Warsh, I would say, into his probably 40s and 50s, um, it dominates your life and you obsess
Yeah.
about it. And it is the first thing you think about when you wake up. And the reality is, you're always missing out. When you're living in that mindset, there's always somewhere you should be or that you missed or it was better down the beach or whatever else.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to be in a place where you can appreciate that for what it was, but still appreciate the beauty of Whidbey
Oh
Island.
yeah. No, I may not have, if I hadn't moved here, I may not have developed the self-awareness that lets me realize, you know what? I love surfing as much as I ever have, and I actually love the act of surfing. But I'm not, it's my relationship with it is my own now. I told Matt when he came up here to visit, I said, you know what I love about what's going on here, Matt? For the first time since I was 12 years old or 11 years old, I can look out at the ocean now and not demand anything of it
Hmm.
and not say, why aren't you doing what I want you to do this. Why aren't you doing it? I can just enjoy the beauty and the majesty of the ocean. And, I'm paddling, you know, all the time. Like, I paddle OC1 outrigger. I got my stand-up paddle race board. I'm out there on the water all the time. So I'm still connecting with it. Um, for example, last week I was coming back from my paddle from out in the strait, came around, I encountered apparently a famous family of orcas, and they had just killed a stellar sea lion, and they were having a blast. And I got to sit and watch this family covert breaching. They had a newborn calf, and I was all alone out there by myself having this incredible interaction amid this beautiful backdrop. I mean, in the distance was Mount Rainier covered with snow. I'm having this incredible interaction with these, these animals, these residents of the, and I was thinking this was as profound an ocean experience as I've ever had. And so there's that side of being up here, that I'm still connected with the tide. I'm still connected with the ocean, even though with the Strait of Juan de Fuca, technically the open ocean is 60 miles from here, but I'm still connected. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I may not have ever reached this state of self-awareness had I not stepped off the path for a little bit and stepped onto a new path.
Good.
And that's one of the thing about the book was that it's not a chronology in a memoir in a classic chronological sense. But when you get to the end and you get to the last story, which deals with me moving up here, you do get a pretty good picture of who I am and how I walked my path up to this point,
Yeah.
and that's why I called it a memoir in progress, because I never once stepped off the path
Yeah.
since I started shipping, not even for a moment. You could say I'm the most boring guy in the world because I never went off on any tangent. Every single day, anyone that knew me, they would know exactly who I would be on the next day.
Yeah.
And this was the first time I ever stepped away from that path, but I didn't, I stepped onto a new path. And so anyway, that's what I really like about the how the book turned out, was that you do get a picture of my path, and in ways that I'm really hoping anyone can relate to. It's not just written specifically for surfers, that through those experiences anyone can relate to the stories that I tell through my experiences, you
Yeah.
know. So yeah, so that's what it's like living up here, a different kind of island life.
Um, we started with talking about 695 different surf spots. Where is next on your hit list? Where do you still want to travel?
That's people ask me that all the time, and it's kind of a tough one. And I know that, see, because a lot of spots I wished I had traveled to years ago before they became kind of mainstream, but I've always wanted to surf in Morocco, you know, uh, the land of right point breaks. Now, okay, I know they're super crowded, and I know that. But I've always wanted to surf Morocco because just something about it. Maybe it's because, like I said, our ship touched there for a day on our way to France, and my brother Matt and I wandered around the waterfront in Casablanca. Maybe that was it, but I don't know. There's something about that Morocco. So yeah, that's one of those spots. Sri Lanka is another one. Those beautiful little boutique sand bottom point breaks. I know they're crowded now, but I don't know. I might, sometimes I think it'd be pretty go there and just to experience the culture. And because after you've done a lot of the travel and surfing, it's never just about the waves. The waves are waves,
Yeah.
you know. It's the reason why, like I tell people, uh, why I never paid to go to Tavarua.
Yeah.
Why I've never paid to go to Tavarua. I've always gone there for work. But why I would take a trip and carry my board on a trailer behind my bike and ride along the coast of Ghana in West Africa all by myself, why I would rather do that than go to Tavarua. Because when you get back from Tavarua, all you can say, the only story you have is, hey, I went to Tavarua. Because everybody's experience in there is always the same. And every
Yeah.
wave there is identical. It's always the same. It's either good or it isn't, you know? So, I don't, certainly at this stage, I don't travel just for the waves. I travel for, what would be a cultural experience or sharing it with others, you know?
Right. Um, Final question
I mean, I
is
love Tavarua. It's fantastic. And people, I mean, it's fantastic. But like I said, it's just never, like my dad, it's never been my bag completely. I've had wonderful times there, but
yeah,
but mostly because I was there doing something.
I get what you're saying for sure.
Yeah, I don't want to bag on Tavarua.
No, 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 no. And the people and the culture there are phenomenal.
Oh
It's
no, I
just,
loved it. I know
you
I
know
spent a
the
lot of time. I li
yeah,
I lived in a Fijian village on the Coral Coast, you know,
Yeah.
I love Fiji and I love the Fijians, so.
Final question for everybody is just when you do actually go surfing, not stand up paddling.
Wait, stand-up
Uh,
paddling is surfing.
well,
What
what
do you
I'm
mean I
saying
go
is
surfing?
when you go out
When
and
I
you
do
ride
when I do
waves,
LDS,
exactly.
yeah, lay down
Uh,
surfing, LDS.
what do you whose boards are you riding is the question.
Okay, I just recently, it was kind of interesting because I've been doing only stand-up paddling for 20 years. Um,
Exclude. I did not know that. I've
oh
only
yeah,
seen you on
no,
a stand up paddle, but I didn't know that that was
no.
exclusive.
Oh, I really occasionally I'll ride a longboard, but
Oh
for the
wow.
last
Okay.
20 years I've surfed exclusively stand-up paddle for a
Okay.
variety of reasons. Um, and I went up to, I was surfing up at, up at the ranch uh, on the West End, and we brought with us a good friend of a friend. He was a shaper named Alan Gibbons. He was a shaper at Channel Islands,
I know who
and
he is.
I was riding really advanced, sleek, super thin, what you would call high performance stand-ups, and surfing really good waves. And he went, "Wow, I thought these were just for paddling around inside the harbor because I didn't know you could surf on these." He goes, I'd love to try to make you one of those. Now, this is a guy that's made 400, 500 neck beards, you know. He goes, I'd love to shape you one. I go, I'd love that. So we worked together and he got on the computer and we worked on the design. And then he had to make the blank, because it's made out of really 1 pound EPS, super light. Uh, and he made me this stand up. And, some people don't understand. They always talk about volume, but we don't mess around with volume. We're talking about thickness and weight. So this is a 9 foot stand up. It weighs 11 pounds. That's
No
less,
way.
that's less than a 7 pound CI mid.
Yeah.
This board, and it's an asymmetrical with a wing on one side, quad. That board works the first one he made, it worked so great that even though I've had other boards, because Bob Pearson, he makes he makes the best stand-up boards ever because mine is the only one that Alan's ever made. He does, it took him so long to make it. He goes, I hope you like this because I'm not going to make you another one for a long time. Bob Pearson makes the best high performance stand-up boards. But this board works so well that even though I've had many other boards in between, I'm still riding it. I mean, it's kind of beat up, but I'm still riding it. So Alan Gibbons, just recently, I said, Alan, I've got to have a laydown board because stand-up boards, they really work best when the waves are really good and it's offshore, the wind's offshore, and it's uncrowded because these boards cover so much ground. Because my board's made specifically for point break surfing, and they cover so much ground. You need a lot of room to surf them. But I said, eventually I might want to surf a beach break or, God forbid, a public break. I need a laydown board. Can you make me a laydown version of my beloved Feel Flows? It's called. The board's called Feel Flows because while he was shaping it, he was listening to the Beach Boys off their Surf's Up album, and the song was called Feel Flows. So I go, can you make me a laydown version of Feel Flows? So he fed all the information into his program, designed it, and he built me a scaled down LDS laydown surfing version of Feel Flows. It's 8 foot. I think it weighs 9 pounds. Okay. It's less than that. It's so light, it's stupid. But it's an asymmetrical quad, what you would call now a sort of a mid-length. And I've only ridden it a couple times. And I mean, I'd love to go back to 1985 and surf it at J Bay. It would be
Mm.
unbelievable.
Is
So
it
that's a
also
long
made
way
out
of
of
saying that right now my board's made by Bob Pearson and Alan Gibbons. And my
great set
latest
of
board,
guys?
oh wait, I
I
also have a vintage new version of the GNS Hot Curl that was one of their hot designs in 1967. It was given
um
to me as a gift by the Gordon family in San Diego from GNS.
Eric and Debbie.
Yep. So after all these years of wanting to go there and be sponsored by GNS, I got a board from GNS. So
Amazing.
I do have a conventional 67 longboard.
You got to ride that thing.
Oh yeah, no, I ride it. I rode it up
Oh,
in
okay, cool.
Rod. You know,
Okay,
the
cool.
waves are small, and I surf it. It was made to surf. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
but compared to my stand-up boards are so maneuverable. Um, and I could go into a long design diatribe right now, and probably no one wants to hear this because they deny that you can surf well on a stand-up. But they're so much more maneuverable because of the continuous curve in the template that lets you drive off the top and drive off the bottom. That when you ride a conventional longboard with all that parallel rail, they're just so stiff. I mean, they're fun to soul arch and arch turn, but compared to my stand-ups, it's the stand-ups are just so much maneuverable that I spend most of my time on the stand-up. See, what a lot
Yeah.
of people don't realize after a certain point, they said, well, why did you ride your stand-up at Kelly Slater's surf ranch? Which is one of the stories that's in the book. I said, well, look, the paddle isn't just to get into the wave. I go, I can paddle in any wave I want. I'm a good paddler. What people don't understand is the paddle, you use it for leverage. I
Hmm.
mean, yes, you get into the wave early on it, and that's a good thing. But surfing wise, what they don't understand is to get a board that has enough volume that you can stand up on it, but that's also big enough to where you don't have to have any parallel rail. You can have a continuous curve in the template. As you drive off the bottom with your body weight, you can't sink all that volume. But with a lever, you put that paddle in the water and lean against it, you can sink all that volume and the board just springs out of the water because every turn is a function of the volume of the board. It's Newton's second law. As you every action, there's a reaction. You watch Aaron Brooks, that little, spidery surfer who weighs like 75 pounds. Boards are tiny because that's the only way she can sink it so that she can come out of a turn. So on a stand-up, you need that leverage. So you might not notice it, but as I drop in, I've touched that to the water and I press down, bury that rail, and the board springs out of the turn. I can create incredible momentum in a point break. So that's why
I've
I generally ride that.
I have seen it. I've never thought about what was really going on.
Yeah.
But now that you're saying it, you're right. I completely have seen that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you
makes a
watch
lot of sense.
Kai Lenny ride short little ones.
Yeah.
But you still watch him do that. The
Hmm.
paddles in the water, lets him compress. Uh, yeah, no, so anyway, that's me in stand-up paddle surfing. But I do
Got it.
have my lay down version, so my
I like it. And
LDS.
I'm thrilled to have heard you say Alan Gibbons and give him so much praise because I people have been directing me to him for a long time. I've never met him, but
Oh, he's
everybody I
great.
know who's gotten boards from him
Yeah.
raves.
Oh no, he's a really good guy and a really good shaper, very analytical. Uh,
Yeah.
can't say enough about him. I don't think he'd ever even shaped a longboard, and he made a 9 foot asymmetrical one wing quad, and it's the best. I'm still riding it.
I love it. All right, Sam. Well, we could go on
Oh yeah,
forever, but I
yeah.
really appreciate you taking the time, and we will, of course,
Okay,
direct everybody to the book in pre roll and post roll, and on the website, hyperlink to it, and all that sort of stuff.
I really appreciate it. And you have all that information, yes?
Yeah.
Look, I really appreciate it. I've watched your podcast, and I always thought, someday I'd like to be on that podcast. You know, I
Well, I'm
just
glad you read.
because
I'm
look, for
glad you.
all the stuff I've done, I mean, you know, you're operating in the realm of surf media that we could have only dreamt of when we were young. You know what I mean? And what the stories you're telling, the way you're offering your perspective and helping others, give their perspective. I mean, I think it's an incredible form of expression, and you're doing a great job. But real
I.
quick, I could ask you, what is that board in the background? That looks like a vintage board.
It's
Oh,
not.
it's the
It's
Quid.
It's there's a whole quiver. It's actually not a vintage. The
Did
color
it look
looks
like
like it's
one?
Volan or something.
Well, you got the, come on, you don't see many white pin lines these day and age.
No, you're
Wait,
right.
skip fry on that other one.
And there's a skip back there too. And the
Yeah.
pin lines fade to nothing, by the way.
Oh, oh, wait, and the rail's pigmented.
And the
That's
rails
a
pigment.
classic.
So it's
Who
actually
made
a
that?
really high performance Vulcan out of San Diego County. The guy's name is Dane Hance. So Vulcan is his label. This side might be
Wow.
easier to see. There you go.
What kind of
Vulcan.
fins does it have on it?
Quad.
Wow.
It's a quad setup.
Oh, yeah, it's a fish. It's kind of fish-like.
Kind of fishy and like
Yeah.
a ton of concave and like a
Uh-huh.
hard edge way up high. It's a very unconventional. I've never had anything like it, and I rode it 5 times and was ready to throw it in the trash. And
Where
then
do
the
you
sixth,
surf?
just Southern California, like
No, but
Huntington,
what kind of
Newport.
wave did, because I find fish work way better down the line.
Well, this is not a conventional fish, first of
Yeah.
all. I literally was like gonna get rid of it after the fifth
Yeah.
session, and then the sixth session fully unlocked it, and it became like my favorite board. But I do ride it in
What
kind of
was the
junky.
secret? Where you put your back foot?
I no, it was just my um I don't know. Maybe I was trying to
Your
impose my
attitude?
will. Maybe my attitude. I think I was actually, now that I think about it, I was trying to ride it probably like a fish,
Yeah.
and it's much more high performance than that. You can almost ride it more like a pointy thruster and really, really rip the board.
Yeah.
Like it's much more maneuverable than I anticipated it to be. And I haven't actually ridden it now in years. That's why it's sitting here in the podcast studio.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah,
Have you ever
Dane.
seen those? Have you ever seen those the hull boards like Greg Little
Yeah,
or Andrini's and stuff?
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to know if I could ride one, so I actually got one from Greg Little. Uh, and I remember I actually drove into the valley and went to Steve Krajewski's house. He's the only guy personally that I think ever rode those the way to their full capacity. Everyone else rides them like they're beer belly boards. But I went and got some instruction from him. And, he gave me a beginner fin. He goes, "No, you don't want the soup. I'm going to give you a beginner fin. And don't try to go backside for at least 2 years," he said.
Yeah.
But I took them and I got to ride it in pretty ideal conditions. Good point surf with nobody else in front of me where I could really get it going. And I basically, every third turn I got right.
Yeah.
It was like, it was so frustrating. And I thought, well, but every third turn, something would happen and I'd get that feeling, but I couldn't trust it to surf it on a regular basis. So eventually, because they're so cherished by their aficionados, I sold it to like a collector. So,
Okay. Yeah, that's how I felt. That skip is actually new. And that's how I felt when I got on that was I was trying to impose my will on it the first few times. And then I realized the board knows how to find trim. The board knows what it's
yeah,
going to do. And I just need to go along for the ride. And then I
yeah.
started to unlock some of it. And I still haven't really ridden it in the right waves, but
That's a really good way of putting it. That you were trying, I was just like you, I was trying to exert my own will. And if I let the board to its own devices, it would really go fast. So
that's what it is. It's kind of just get up and just let it figure it out and go along for the ride. And that's
I could talk about
usually the
surfboards
right.
I could talk about surfboards all day. So
All
okay, well,
right.
listen, great. And if down the road ever you want to do another one of these about a different topic, I really enjoyed talking to you. I really, you can imagine up here especially, but not just that. I really appreciate intelligent, insightful conversation about surfing. So
Well, thanks.
this was so much fun for me. So
Thank you. My whole goal, for the record, is just to get out of the way of interesting people. So I will always come prepared with an outline and questions, but I'm happy to throw that out and just get out of the way. So you made my
it
job
was
easy.
I've interviewed hundreds of people in, magazines and documentary films. And, I know what it's like to be interviewed and I know what it's like to interview. You do a fantastic job. That's all I'm
Cool.
saying.
Thanks, man.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right. Well,
Chat
listen,
soon.
thanks again.
Surf Splendor.